Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, September 22nd, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you for having me back in the show. Thank you. Yeah.
Colonel, let's start with the case of the Palestinian state. We know that the British government, together with Australia and Canada, they have recognized the state of Palestine. And many people are arguing the hypocrisy on the part of the British government. On one part, they're trying to help Israel militarily and in terms of the intelligence. The spy plane is just going over Gaza and gathering information, give it to the Israelis. On the other hand, they're pushing for a two-state solution. And Israel was not happy, by the way, with the new decision on the part of these governments. How do you see the situation with the state of Palestine? Do you think this recognition would somehow benefit the state of Palestine, or it's just somehow a political posture and doesn't mean that much for Palestine?
Well, it's a little bit like the glass, which is half empty or half full. It's certainly a positive step to for let's say a Western country to recognize Israel, because so far you had about 150 state recognizing the state of Israel, but those who were in the West, United States and Europe, refused to recognize this state. So it's a good step forward to have UK, Canada, and Australia, and tomorrow probably France as well, recognizing the state of Israel. But we have to be very modest. I mean, we have to be very humble about this, because first of all, this recognition, which by the way has been already formalized in the UN, because the state of Israel is already recognized as a state by the United Nations. It has an observer status. It has not the full member status because of the Western countries refused that, but it's already recognized as a state. This is also something like the Holy Siege or the Vatican, which has been recognized as a state, officially a state, but it has observer status in the UN. The same as Switzerland up to 2002. Switzerland was an observer state, but the state of Switzerland was recognized. So today we'll have a very similar status for Palestine, which is already a step forward. But again, the problem is that there is absolutely no incentive in the West, because the rest of the world has probably not the political weight to do it. But in the West, you have no incentive to make something of this recognition. At the end of the day, we just recognize that the state of Palestine does exist, and period. This is not related to some kind of strategy to engage into a dialogue that would eventually lead to a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that's disturbing, in fact, because we see that all these countries, which, by the way, are all countries that have domestic issues, and that's very true with Keir Starmer in the UK and Emmanuel Macron in France. And obviously, this recognition is more related to the domestic situation in their country than to the improvement of the situation in Palestine. Because at the same time, as you rightly pointed out, with the spy flights done from Cyprus by the Royal Air Force, and other countries, by the way, who have also provided intelligence to Israelis, and the delivery of weapons. That includes France, UK, US, obviously. So meaning that on the one hand, we give a little something to the Palestinian, and on the other hand, we make everything to fuel the conflict and feed the conflict. So there is some kind of hypocrisy there. Uh, there is another aspect that disturbs me because, for instance, France, what Emmanuel Macron said, he's ready to recognize the state of Palestine, but there's a condition: this state must be disarmed, Hamas must be disarmed, the Palestine must be disarmed, have no army, and things like that. So, meaning that if recognizing the state of Palestine is one thing, making Palestine as a sovereign state is another. And there is absolutely no move from within the Western community to make Palestine a sovereign state. First of all, obviously, as we have mentioned that last year on your channel, by the way, you may remember that at the request of the UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, that was in July last year, if I'm not wrong, the International Court of Justice ruled that the occupation by Israel of the West, of the Palestinian territories, that applies to Gaza, but also to the West Bank, this occupation is illegal. And the International Court of Justice called all the UN member states to help Israel to vacate those areas and to let the Palestinians have their own settlement in those places. So far, as you probably noticed, there's absolutely not a single country that made any move to implement this resolution. After the decision of the ICG, there was a resolution by the UN General Assembly requesting Israel to remove all the settlements and all the settlers. They should return into Israel. But not a single Western country has even suggested it would help Israel in this. Meaning that we recognize Palestine, which is a mere political gesture, but we make nothing, but virtually nothing, zero, to have Palestinians or to make the Palestinians having their own sovereign country. And that should be the name of the game. And since the International Court of Justice has ruled that the so-called occupied Palestinian territory are Palestinians and not Israelis, and that the Israelis must go out of those territories, what else do we need? Obviously, we need to enforce this. And we have France, which is very keen to claim deploying troops for Ukraine and wherever, reinsurance forces and security guarantees and all that. But at the same time, it does strictly nothing to implement the mere existence of a sovereign state in Palestine. So there is something extremely disturbing there, that the West make just this gesture just to, in fact, just to calm their domestic public opinion, period. That's all. But they don't intend to do anything. They don't make any pressure on the government of Israel to implement the UN resolutions, and therefore nothing will really change for the Palestinians. In addition to that, if we look, this is related to the sovereignty of Palestine, because both the UK and the France, as I said, they made conditions for this state to exist, namely to disarm Hamas and things like this. And here there's also kind of a doctrinal issue there. You know, the usual practice in modern times when we recognize states, I mean, first of all, we recognize states, not governments. And that's very important. I mean, when when we recognize a state, that means we know that a state of Palestine, France, Switzerland, whatever, exists, regardless of who is in charge in this state. The problem is that we have seen that already with Venezuela, for instance, during the previous mandate of Donald Trump. That and at that time, you remember, we have all this issue with Maduro, Juan Guaido, and all that. And the issue was that Western countries, UK, US, France, and others, stopped recognizing Venezuela as a state, but started to recognize Maduro as the government, the Maduro government. And therefore, they didn't want to recognize Maduro, and they wanted Juan Guaido. And when you start recognizing governments instead of states, that means that in fact you interfere with domestic politics. You know, if you say, well, I will recognize France, but only if they have a socialist or whatever government, then you are trying to interfere with local politics. That's the reason why when you recognize, let's say, a country like France, you recognize the country, the state, period. And then you may have a leftist government, a right-wing government, whatever government. That is not the problem. You recognize the state, and then, depending on how elections decide, you may have a right-wing, left-wing, or whoever, and then it's up to your diplomacy to find the right line of communication, if you want, to dialogue with this country. But the recognition is not related to the government they have. So why do we do something like this for Palestine? When you say, well, recognize just if they disarm Hamas. Recognition of a state is not an award, it's not a reward. You see, recognition of a state is just to recognize a geopolitical fact, and then when the state exists, I mean, when you recognize this state and you recognize the other one, such as Israel. By the way, Israel, why do we recognize Israel? You know, it has no defined territory, which is normally a condition to have a recognized state. So, because Israel has never defined its borders, so it has no defined territory, but we still recognize Israel as a state, even if it has Netanyahu as a head of government. So why don't we put a condition on the government? Because obviously it's not the normal practice. We recognize a state, and in Israel, by the way, it's a huge concession because Israel doesn't meet the condition to be recognized as a state because it has no borders. The Palestinians have borders, and they have defined them, and therefore you can argue that probably their government is not very stable, but they have one, even if we don't like it, but they have one. So the problem here is that when you start putting conditions on why and how you want to recognize a government or state, there is something biased in all that. And that shows that what the West gives with the right hand, it takes it away from the left hand, with the left hand. So this is something, this is a little bit insane. And I think the fundamental issue here is that de facto, we don't have normal relationships with Israel. And this is every single country on this planet which has a diplomatic relation with Israel has not normal relations. The reason being that Israel, if you do something they don't like, they will punish you. By the way, that's exactly what they said to France. If they recognize the state of Palestine, then there will be a punishment given by Israel. And this country is a country that used blackmail as a foreign policy tool. And that's the real issue with all that. At the end of the day, we tend to deal with Israel as we deal with a mafia boss, because people are afraid of what could happen if they don't do what Israel does. That applies to the U.S. government as well. That's the reason why Trump strikes Iran, even if they didn't want to in the first place. And that's not how international relations should go. And just recently, you had Bezalel Smotrich, the famous or infamous minister of culture or finance, sorry, in the Israeli government, who said that Israel, because it's a chosen people, are above international law. Just said it. So how can you have normal relations with a country that declares it's above international law, who, by the way, demonstrably has never abidden by international law? The problem here is definitely the way Israel behave, and that's something that should be corrected. I mean, in some way, and probably the pressure that is building up in the Middle East, and probably one illustration of that is the recent mutual defense agreement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. That illustrates the fact that more and more in the Middle East, people are fed up with Israel. The problem is that because the West doesn't want to explain Israel, when I say explain, it's a euphemism, to force Israel to comply with international law. Failing to do that in the West, we are putting Israel in a situation where it will be probably attacked, destroyed, or whatever by the rest of the region. You see, because we fail to, let's say, not even condemn, but because we fail to tell Israel what's wrong, we create a situation where Israel is encouraged to do worse. And that's very true with the recent declaration by the Commission of the Human Rights Commission of the UN, saying that Israel commits genocide. Remember that when we talked about genocide, and when the ICJ was the International Court of Justice was seized by the government of South Africa in order to study if Israel was performing genocide, the issue there was not to condemn Israel for committing genocide, because the Convention of 1948 is not about a committed genocide. The Convention is about preventing a genocide, meaning that had we acted in October, end of 2023 or early 2024 to tell Israel, well, no, you are on the path of performing a genocide, stop it, otherwise you would have consequences, We never did that. And oh, so many people that know there is no genocide. And true, there is no genocide. There was no genocide yet. The problem is the convention on the genocide is not related to the number of people killed. Because if there might be a developing genocide, the first victim, there is a first victim, and you can stop the genocide at this level already. It's about preventing genocide, not about condemning genocide. Now that the Human Rights Commission has ruled that the Israel is committing genocide, now we can condemn Israel for genocide. But before that, we couldn't. It was a plausible genocide, meaning that we had, or the Western countries had the opportunity to stop that and to avoid Israel getting into a situation where it will be condemned by everybody. You see, and that's exactly the same thing we have here with the whole situation. We, by not advising properly Israel, by not making or to force Israel by complying to international law, we press Israel into a situation where the only solution will be its destruction. This is something that I don't understand why people don't understand that, because what we see right now, and we have seen this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Nota bene, Pakistan is supported by China. Iran is supported by China. Saudi Arabia has ballistic missiles coming from China. And now all these people are together. And you have more and more people who are on the same wavelength as these countries. And instead of talking about Sunni policies or countries and Shia countries, we are talking about Islamic countries. And the problem is that Israel is so arrogant that he has not the ability to identify these problems. Or better said, Israel is so confident that the West would jump in if there is a problem, then they can afford to do every violation they can, because the West will come to rescue the Israeli government on the first occasion. But it's not the way things should go. We should anticipate these issues and preventively force Israel to comply with international law. We should send, and the Security Council should send, peace enforcement force in the Palestinian occupied territory, and to make all the Israelis go back to Israel and keep the Palestinian territory for the Palestinians. That should be the enforcement of international law, But failing to do so, we are creating a situation where the only solution will be the destruction of Israel. I mean, if we listen to what has been said in Israel recently regarding the West Bank and even Gaza, that all these Palestinians must go out and they have to go to Egypt and all that, and Egyptians don't want. I mean, when you send all the Palestinians to Egypt, this is just kicking the can down the road. You see, so and Egypt has understood that. That's the reason why they have closed the border. It's not because they don't like the Palestinians, but because by closing the border, by not closing the border, let's say Egypt would do the game for Israel. The Palestinian territory is a Palestinian territory, not an Israeli territory. Israel has to abide by this, not the rest of the world. You see, and that's Egypt has realized this. By the way, that's also Egypt has recently raised the issue of having a military alliance in order to cope with the problem of Israel, because obviously they realize that Israel is becoming an increasing problem in the region, especially after the bombing of Qatar. We see that Israel has absolutely no shame attacking the allies of, I mean, even its own allies to some extent. Because remember that if you have the Hamas in Qatar for negotiation, is at the request of Israel and at the request of the US. Meaning that, how can you trust a country like Israel? And therefore, you have to be, let's say, more than prudent. You have to anticipate the fact that even if you have all kind of agreement with Israel, that will not prevent Israel from attacking you, because they are above international law. Not single country in the world could say that, but only Israel said it. And therefore, there is a point where you say, well, the threat is so obvious, then we need to reduce the threat. Therefore, I would suggest that before we reach that point, Western countries should be well inspired to advise Israel and even to force Israel to comply with international law.
Colonel, the U.S. envoy Tom Brock said that Netanyahu doesn't care about borders and red lines and will go anywhere and do anything if he feels that Israel is threatened. Looking at the behavior of Israel today, and for those leaders in the Arab states that they felt that they're immune from Israeli threat, from the attack from Israel, they don't feel the same way anymore. You see Sisi in Egypt coming out that they're prepared to defeat Israel.
Mhm.
You know, these are new. We can say that these Arab leaders are not that much powerful, but the tone is changing. The attitude is changing.
Well, the attitude is changing because the balance of power in the world is changing too. Uh, we just mentioned this mutual defense pact between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Remember that Saudi Arabia used to be protected or had a defense agreement with the US. And now it is seeking the nuclear deterrent from Pakistan, no longer from the US, meaning that the trust in the US is decreasing. And there's no surprise there, because the US behave a little bit like Israel, not for the same reason, but because they are so powerful that they can afford to ignore the international law. By the way, it's that in their own policy that they are no longer abiding by the international law-based order, but by the international rule-based order, where the rules are defined by the US. Meaning that you never know exactly how US will behave. And we have seen that recently in the last 6 months by the various attacks performed by the US or by the Israelis in the middle of negotiation processes. Meaning that both the US and Israel, for different reasons, but the result is the same, that they have absolutely no rules. I mean, they have no rules. They have their own rules. But if it suits them, they will attack regardless of how good the relations are with Israel or the US. Meaning that the relations with those countries is totally unpredictable. And that explains also all the move we have discussed many times about the BRICS and all that, because people try to protect themselves from unpredictability. And by the way, we see a similar move on financial markets and all that, because what people don't like is unpredictability. You need to have some kind of stability in political, financial, relations, in order to, let's say, have your own strategy. If you have relations with people that are totally unpredictable, how can you elaborate any kind of trade or political strategy? You don't know what tomorrow will be. And obviously today we see that those who provide this kind of stability are precisely Eurasian powers: China, Russia, India. And for that reason, other countries try to develop their relationships with those countries who have, let's say, an inherent stability. You can count on them, and for trade policy and all that. That's the key problem. And the fact that Saudi Arabia now tries to find alternative solution to have, let's say, kind of defense agreement, illustrates perfectly the decreasing impact of the US. And we see also that the US, even if it claims to be the strongest country or power, superpower, or whatever, it's unable to impose its will to Israel. In fact, we have the feeling it's the opposite, that the US does what Israel wants and not the opposite. That's exactly what we have seen with the attack on Iran. This was certainly not in the interest of the US. And the US was in a negotiation process, by the way. So when it attacked Iran, it was for the sake of Israel, not for the sake of Washington. Meaning that, how can you trust such a country? And the same applies to all the traditional allies or friends of the US. Egypt, as an example. We have seen also what happened to Syria. Not even mentioning the fact that Bashar al-Assad was toppled, but even with Ahmed al-Sharaa, we can see that it used to be the friend of everybody, and now everybody is, when Israel attacks Syria, nobody comes to help him. So how can you build a network of friendly countries if they are unreliable? You see, so you will seek for reliability, and obviously this reliability is provided by Eurasian countries, and this explains partly why you have this shift in the balance of power, and the power is going eastwards instead of remaining in the West. I'm not even mentioning Europe, which is totally unreliable because it's not even able to do things. It's people who talk but are unable to act. And when they talk, you don't even understand what exactly they want. Meaning that Europe has completely disappeared from the, let's say, global scene. The US is still active, but totally unreliable. And we have seen that also with Ukraine. I mean, one day the US supports Ukraine, the next day it's no longer supporting. I mean, how can you make any long-term planning or long-term strategy, or trying to find let's say, a negotiation strategy when you don't even know how your allies or your friends will behave? You see, this is the problem of the West today. It is so insecure in itself. I mean, inherently insecure. People don't know what to do, and that's exactly the same thing as I mentioned before about Palestine. Yes, we recognize Palestine, but we put conditions that are in fact almost nullifying what we do. So how can you trust those people? At the end of the day, your only solution is to have independent and local or regional solutions. And since Israel is the enemy, but then you consider it as an enemy, and you build up alliances and coalitions or whatever in order to fight the threat. Now, when we talk about Israel as a threat, we have to remember that I mentioned that Israel has no borders, no official borders. This is the only country in the world, by the way, which has not defined its own borders. What we see on the maps, this kind of banana-shaped form of Israel, this shape is in fact the armistice line of 1949, which has been admitted as let's say, a tolerated border, but it's not an official border. And the UN has requested many times from the Israel to define clearly its border, but Israel has always declined this. And the reason is in one of the fundamental laws of Israel. Israel has no constitution as such. It has just a set of fundamental laws. One of them has been the law that has been adopted the day for the independence of Israel on the 14th of May, 1948. And in this document, when drafting this document, the committee or the commission that was led by Ben Gurion, by the way, it was the idea that probably in this document, Israel should define its borders. And the commission, at the end, after deliberating, renounced of this. They said, we will not define a border. Because, and the reason is very simple, because at that time, Ben Gurion and others were all these people who thought that the territory of Israel should extend eastwards in the greater Israel. And therefore, the borders that you had on the 14th of May, 1948, were designed to be only provisional. And what they had in mind at that stage was to reconquer Jordan, which at the time was called Transjordan, because that was Jordan, what we call today Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, used to be part of the historic Palestine under the British Mandate. And the first authorities of Israel contemplated the idea of reconquesting or reconquering, I don't know the word, but the Jordan, and therefore not to define the border. And since then, they have never defined the borders. But defining the border should be the prerequisite to recognize a state in reality. And very recently, Benjamin Netanyahu mentioned that their goal is to have the greater Israel, so to go well beyond the current borders. So meaning that when we see all that, we see that Israel has as a hidden, half-hidden doctrine to expand eastwards. This banana-shaped that we see today is only a transitional thing. And if you look, by the way, on official maps of Israel, you will see that they include the occupied territories in their official maps, meaning that this, for Israel, this is already something that belongs to them, period. They just need to convince the rest of the world, but for them it's clear. And this may also expand westwards. And remember, I think I mentioned that on your channel a few weeks ago, that I think it was Ben Greer who said that South Lebanon belongs to Israel. So we see that the problem here is that Israel is an expansionist entity, that it's an entity that disregards officially the international law. And now, when you are an outsider, when you are just a neighbor of this entity, what's your reaction? I mean, your reaction is to say, well, we should prepare for that. We should anticipate the fact that Israel will most probably attack us. We don't know exactly when, but this probably will come. And therefore, to anticipate all this by creating coalitions or military alliances and all that. And this goes, obviously, because it's about the survival of all these states. This is something that goes beyond any relationship they may have with the Western world. And in addition to the fact that the Western world, in fact, would be more keen to support Israel than supporting other countries. We have seen that with Syria, for instance. Even when all the Western countries applauded when Ahmed al-Shara came to the power in last year, when Israel invaded the rest of the Golan Heights, nobody reacted in the West. The same as the last year in November, when the Israel signed this agreement, ceasefire agreement with Lebanon, they never implemented this. Who reacted negatively in the West? Nobody. We don't care. When Israel infringes the international law, there's absolutely no reaction. So if you look at this from an Israeli point of view, why should you bother or be bothered by this? I mean, the West will anyway agree at one point, or will confirm what we do. So why should I bother? Therefore, if you are in the Middle East, you understand how the mechanic works, and therefore you create your own tool to counter this. And today, since we have this shift in the power at global level towards the East, and as I said before, the Saudi Arabia now has ballistic missile DF-3, DF-21 coming from China. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this was not possible. I mean, you had probably Soviet Union, but only the West was in a position to have, let's say, an influential position in the Middle East. Today, it's very different. China, not militarily, by the way, not by military pressure, but because China has developed very close trade relationships with all these countries, that all these countries depend on China for accessing some technologies. Remember the project, the Saudi project of this huge city building, the Neom city, you see this high-tech city. All that is only possible with Chinese technology. I don't know what the status of the project is, but definitely Saudi Arabia is looking ahead to have some, let's say, a new orientation in new technologies, because the oil is not forever, and therefore they have to find alternative. And this alternative will not be given by the West, because the West has not the capability of providing that. Therefore, the China, Russia is providing more and more support. I mean, you want nuclear power, you ask the Russians. The Russians are probably the best expert in nuclear power plants in the world, even better than Western countries. Therefore, you have everything you want if you just consider having China, Russia, and India as a partner. So why should you bother about the West? And that may, at a certain point, affect the way this country behave toward Israel. Unless Israel realizes that it's probably in their own interest to develop normal relationships with the rest of the world, including their neighboring country. Because so far, if you look at 80 years of presence of Israel in the region, you could say, what is the added value of Israel? Zero. It's a negative value. It has brought only destruction, death, torture, massacres. It's everything that Israel has brought to the region. So why should you bother keeping this country there? It is a problem, not a solution. So if Israel realizes that it has the potential to be an added value for the region, and therefore to change its foreign policy from confrontation to cooperation, probably things may change for Israel. But if it continues on the path it is now, I predict that Israel will be destroyed.
Yeah. Carl, with the case of Israel, I don't know if you heard that the Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs, he said that the new axis of evil is Syria, Turkey, and Qatar. And it seems to me that the United States doesn't have any sort of plan for Israel because they're trying to do everything to somehow help Israel, but they don't have any sort of red line for the administration in Israel. When you see Donald Trump talking about getting back to Afghanistan, to Bagram air base, and he says that even giving it back to those people who built it, which wasn't the United States, it was the Soviet Union in the 1950s. It's somehow amazing. It shows how, even the president of the United States doesn't know the reality of the Middle East. He doesn't know the reality of the United States when he talks this way to Afghanistan. And how can we expect that they can do something rational when it comes to Israel? This is the level of ignorance that I don't know who's going to be able. When you look at Europe, I think the only option, the only alternative on the table would be the way that Europe can talk about. But you don't see that sort of stamina in Europe to
Yeah,
even go in that direction.
absolutely. This is something which is quite depressing, in fact, when you see that, because the leadership in the U.S. is, I mean, Trump behaves like a spoiled child. You'll see. Once he wants the Panama Canal, the next day he wants the Greenland, and he wants to buy it, and even to send troops there. Sometimes this looks so childish that you really wonder how people can even grow to up to this point. Seriously. I mean, he has probably a good idea. He wants peace. He wants to stop the war there and all that. But you see that there's no consistency. There is no plan. There is no strategy to address that. He wants to stop it, and he thinks that because the US is so powerful, it is enough to say stop it, and people will stop. And that's the reason why he's disappointed about Putin, because when he said to Putin, "Go stop the war," Putin say, "Well, sorry, but my objectives are different." So, and now he's frustrated. I mean, Trump is frustrated, but he's frustrated because he has this childish approach to international relations, that you don't dialogue with people, you just impose things because you are strong. And so the same with Bagram, this base in Bagram, where I used to go, by the way, when I was in Afghanistan. But the problem is that we don't even understand exactly what he wants to do. I mean, he imagined that the Americans are welcome in a country where they wage a war for 20 years without building anything. You see, when it's very interesting, since you mentioned the Soviet Union, when Soviet Union left the Afghanistan in 1989, The government that had been protected, because that was the purpose of the presence in the Soviet presence in Afghanistan, was to ensure the government that was in place. This government stayed in place for more than 2 years after the departure of the Soviets. When the Americans left in 2021, the government they had in place lasted just for 2 days, not even. Does just show exactly something I remember. I don't know if I mentioned that. When I was in Afghanistan, I had a driver, uh, uh, and this driver was a Pashtun, obviously the same ethnic group of the Taliban. And he was a very good guy, very, very nice person, and an old person, but very nice. And we had good relation. And at one point, I asked him, "What do you feel about the Taliban?" And he told me, "You know, we don't like the Taliban. But if we had to choose between the Westerners and the Taliban, we'll choose the Taliban." Everything was said, period.
That's it.
That's it. The problem is that the West has never tried to understand those people. And that's the reason why they have never been able to control the Afghanistan, because they don't try to even to understand. That's part of our probably a Western and European legacy, that we think that we are superior, and therefore everybody has to do as we do and not the opposite. As a result, we tend to ignore how people think. We tend to ignore their mindset. We tend to ignore what they live for. You see, we live, and I'm living in Europe. I'm part of this European culture, which we need to have, where we need to have two TV sets and one computer and all that, and we cannot conceive life without all these technological gadgets and all that, because that's our perception of life. But when you go in Africa or in Southwest of Asia and all that, people can perfectly have a normal life without having a computer, without having two cars, or without having, because they understand life. They have their perception of life is different than ours. And even sometimes I remember in Africa, I was surprised to see in very small villages, people who could speak 5 languages fluently, have a computer literacy that was just amazing, but they had no computers. But they were completely able to deal with a computer and even understand all the small tricks that you may need in order to tweak Windows or whatever. So meaning that this literacy does exist, not that they are ignorant. They know that. They understand perfectly French. When I was in Congo, for instance, French, English, Lingala, Swahili, and they speak fluently all these languages. And they have been at school, and they are very able to understand, read, whatever. They understand things, and they even understand because they listen very much to radio or sometimes watch TV, and they understand politics, Western politics, much better than we do sometimes. But they don't need that to live. They can have a life which is extremely simple, in a very, I would say, healthy environment sometimes. I mean, it's not always easy, to be honest. And when I say healthy, mentally healthy, probably, even if in Congo I have seen terrible things, but we will not discuss that today. In any case, what I mean is that those people can have a simple life. They don't need to have all the gadgets we think we need to live in our countries. And this perception of life is something that it's very difficult to understand with our culture, unless you lived in those countries, unless you experienced a more simple life. Because I have been in crisis countries, spent many years in Africa, in crisis countries for the UN, and obviously you don't have all the luxury that you may expect in the West, and you understand better how people can understand life somehow, because you are forced to live much in a much simpler way. And that's exactly the same in Afghanistan. We cannot understand people who fight, who used to fight in Afghanistan barefoot in the mountain with just a very old-fashioned or old type rifle, and fight efficiently against high-tech army, modern armies, and things like that. So we don't understand these people, and we don't want to understand them. And that's exactly the reason why we're unable to address the issues that we see in those areas. We see that when you have a problem in this region, the only possible response is to bomb them, to intervene militarily, or to force them through sanctions and things like that. Whereas you could achieve better results with just talking, just sitting a few hours with them, talking to them, and be truthful with what you said. I mean, if you when you say something, you do what you say. But we are not able to do that because we are above law. We are somehow not far away very often than the Israelis. We think that we are above law. By the way, most countries today also have their foreign policy based on rule-based order, international rule-based order, and not the law-based order. And that's an indication that we think that we can be above law somehow. In any case, when you look at the conflicts that we had in the Middle East, it's mostly because we didn't keep our word. We signed, we decided, we agreed on something, and then the West, most of the time, in fact, changed its mind because it was no longer exactly what Donald Trump recently said, because he feels that he asked for a revision of all the agreements that United States has signed, because he feels that these agreements, the international agreements signed by the US, infringe on US sovereignty. See, that's exactly that. You cannot even, and that was very recently, just a couple of days ago, Trump asked for this revision, meaning that they're ready to just abandon what they have signed. How can you trust such people? You sign an agreement, just a few years later, you just drop you scrap the agreement because it doesn't suit you anymore. How can you trust such kind of people? But we are like this. This is unfortunately the way we behave. And in other countries, and I have seen that many times, in Africa, but also in the Middle East, that many times you don't sign a contract because the word is enough. And they tell you, that's my word is my signature. This is another way of understanding this, some kind of sense of honor. And because we are not used to that, because in our society, we cannot trust people. That's the reason why we always need to have a paper, a document, and signed paper and all that, because we cannot trust each other. But I have seen a very moving examples with people who, even if the agreement was not in their favor, it said, well, that's what decided. So that was my word. That's my word, period. Even if it's not in my favor. This is a very high level of morality that they have, much higher than we do. And that's exactly what is missing to us, and then what is missing to um, make those people trusting us, because we don't trust them, and therefore how can they trust us, especially when we change our mind every single day. And that's very true with Trump. I mean, we're not even talking about background and all that, but when we see with Ukraine, one day it's this, the other day is that. He cuts the funding, then or he doesn't deliver weapons, and now he delivers weapons, and all that, and all that creates kind of uncertainty in the political leadership, even in Europe. That's the rationale or the reason, better than the rationale, of the drone issues that we have now in the Baltic states and all that. Everything is based on the fact that suddenly Trump decided that they are not funding these countries anymore, because they don't have the money, because they don't have the resources. And now they realize, instead of planning that in advance and saying, well, in 6 months from now, I will have no longer the ability to fund you, therefore I will stop in 6 months. No, suddenly they realize they don't have the funding, therefore they stop. That means the whole leadership, the whole uh, political relationship, totally unpredictable and unreliable at the same time. And this is something we can observe for every single case we are witnessing today in Europe. Now we have so much relied on the narrative to convince ourselves that we are good, and suddenly we realize that the reality is catching up. Is catching up, and now we realize that we are wrong, and therefore suddenly we have to change policies and all that, and that's done very in a very abrupt way, and it just creates more uncertainty. It creates more unpredictability, and at the end of the day, it creates kind of a distrust from other countries, and logically, predictably, they don't trust us anymore. And therefore, that's the reason why more people are now leaning towards the BRICS and the OCS, the SCO, sorry, and other organizations, because they feel that those organizations are more reliable.
Yeah. I think when you see political writes about the Europe's century of humiliation, you can understand this humiliation doesn't come from outside. You're making it from inside, from Europe. You're making it in each and every country.
That's coming to addition, but I'm convinced that if the West would be more honest, all these years of humiliation could be forgotten easily, because in those countries they are much less, how would I say that, revengeful as we are. I mean, you have different culture, they are based on revenge. The Israelis are, this is, everything is about revenge, and the word revenge is a very strong concept in their culture. It's a little bit like this in the West, but where it's the least strong, in my view, based on my personal experience, is in Muslim countries. They have a better ability to forget things if something better is coming. Meaning that if we would be more honest with them and consider them as real partners, all these years of confrontation humiliation, or that could be forgotten, provided something better is in sight. But we are not providing that. We just come to them with sanctions, more punishment, the threat of intervention and bombing and things like that, instead of trying to solve problems. It's very indicative. I mean, it is something I don't remember if we discussed that, and I don't want to open a new chapter because obviously we have probably not much time to talk. But the importance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, this idea, this organization was created to solve water issues in Central Asia. It's an organization based on to resolve or solve situation through dialogue. You see, and it's not a problem to solve conflict through or having more armies or coalitions or things like that. No, it's a system, or it's a mechanism to engage into dialogue when you have regional problems. There is nothing equivalent in Europe. We have NATO, we have not OSCE, could have been that, but we didn't even use it for that. But we have no, in the East, in Asia, they have the SCO before having the equivalent of a NATO. In the West, we create NATO before having a mechanism to resolve conflict. I mean, the UN could be that, but here again, we have forgotten that because the UN has become so politicized and so, let's say, handicapped by the veto powers and the abuse of veto power by US especially, meaning that this conflict resolution mechanism is no longer really effective. But in Asia, you have this mechanism, and a lot of people are now using the SCO in order to have a peaceful resolution of conflict. So why the West could not be inspired by this example? I always said, and that's something, by the way, that the Russians have always asked for in Europe, to have security through cooperation instead of security through confrontation. And and I think that's something that probably is more related to the Asian mentality or the Asian continent, better than mentality. I don't know. But in the West, definitely, we each time there is a problem, we need to go into confrontation. I mean, when you have drones in Poland, suddenly you have to send more planes and increase that. Even if you don't know what it is, it starts to be a military problem. By default, it's a military problem. Before being a problem, a political one or a foreign policy one, thing like that. By default, it's a military problem. Whereas in the rest of the world, a problem by default is something you can talk about. Then if it fails, then you probably increase the level. And that's, in my view, is probably more wise than what we do in the West.
Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.